Matt Brynildson, the Brewmaster from Firestone Walker and four-time World Beer Cup champion, joins me to talk about hops and Firestone Walker brewing. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 139. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 139. It's late December 2016. Matt Brynildson, the Brewmaster from Firestone Walker, joins me to discuss hops. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running an amazing deal right now, only $19.99 for a year-long subscription or $17.99 for the digital edition. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for home brewers and beer lovers, and you can read my new column called Ask the Experts as well. Take advantage of their special deal now at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the world-class line of brewing equipment from Blickman Engineering. John Blickman has his first ever holiday giveaway where you can win a BrewEasy system, Quick Carb Instant Carburetor, Hellfire Burner, or BrewVision Controller. You can enter for free by clicking on the banner at blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And finally, my BeerSmith software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers, that lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Download your free 21-day trial from beersmith.com today. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today I welcome the Brewmaster from Firestone Walker, Matt Brynildson, to the show. Matt is a 5-time GABF Brewer of the Year and 4-time World Beer Cup champion brewmaster. He holds trophies and medals in just about every beer category. And we are honored to have Matt on the show. Matt, it's great to have you, man.
Honored to be here.
So I had the great honor of meeting you when we were brewing together at the Craft Beer and Brewing Retreat back in October in Colorado, and had a great time doing that. Did you enjoy the event too?
Yeah, that was the second year that I've been involved in that event. One, it's a beautiful venue. It's also a lot of really passionate home brewers and beer enthusiasts, and getting to hang out with the likes of you, along with John Mallett, Stephen Powell. We had Tommy Arthur this year, Andy from Avery. So it's a good group. It's a lot of fun. And
Yep.
Quite honestly, I don't do a lot of home brewing anymore. You might find that hard to believe. But,
No, you don't. You gave up home brewing, really?
I still have all my equipment, but I don't do it often. So to get up there and to use some, modern home brewing equipment and kind of be forced back into it, it was a lot of fun.
Now, John, he's kind of like a mad scientist, really,
John's one of my best friends.
We had him on the show a couple weeks ago, Andrea from Valley Malting, and they were very entertaining. I got some great pictures of John in drag as well. So I'll have to send them to you after the show.
Okay. No, I've spent a lot of time with John over the years. We've been friends for more than 15 years. We've literally traveled the world together for beer. And I can't say enough about him.
He's a good guy. Well, I got to watch you formulate a recipe and brew it, which was a lot of fun. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the recipe you picked and what you were trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah, so over the course of the last year, we've been working really hard here at Firestone Walker anyway on luponic distortion. And luponic is our big release for 2016. Now we're at the end of the year, so we've been in the market with that beer for a good 9 months or so. And that is what that homebrew recipe was inspired by. Essentially, when we decided to put yet another IPA into the market, we looked pretty hard at our current portfolio and realized that there was a nice little niche or a hole in the program. Union Jack, our first IPA, 7.5% alcohol. Easy Jack came along later on at 4.5% alcohol. So there was a sweet spot at about 6% that we had yet to fill. And as it turns out, as we look at hoppy beers or hoppy beer styles and trying to express hop aroma and flavor in these beers, it tends to be the lower alcohol beers that really allow hops to pop. I don't think it's just that I'm getting older and lower alcohol beers are appealing to me more and more, but it's nice. In our panels, quite often we'll stack the beers up in terms of IBUs and alcoholic strength. And therefore, Union Jack is always kind of at the end, and Easy Jacks is somewhere in the middle of our sensory panels. And day after day, I noticed that Easy Jack pops more than beers with even more hops, more aggressively brewed beers. So it's kind of a long story, but essentially, Luponic Distortion came to be a beer that we felt would really express hops, and we focus on new hop cultivars with that beer. And that's what we were trying to make up there in the mountains.
Now, IPAs have become a large portion of your sales now, right?
It is. I mean, I think still to this day, IPA is the biggest category for craft. And I find that really interesting, kind of as a little bit of a tangent here, is I do a fair amount of work for Hop Growers of America abroad. And that's essentially going out and teaching at some of the brewing schools like Weinstefan, BLB, some schools in Belgium and in Scandinavia, and try to talk about American grown hops and in a way market those to European brewers. And we always use the IPA style as the great example of what hops can do for the industry, I guess. And oftentimes we paint a picture that it was hops that really were the great differentiator for craft versus the kind of mass-produced beers that we all grew up on. And, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, a lot of brewers in Europe were like rolling their eyes at me and, there's no way these IPAs could ever make it in this market. And now we're seeing those beers doing really well overseas as well. It seems like every top 20 craft brewer anyway has an IPA as their lead dog in their portfolio. Even breweries like New Belgium now have things like Ranger that are leading the charge in their programs. So it's hard to deny that IPA is a strong contender in this time and place in the beer world.
Well, today you wanted to talk about hops and some of the things you learned about hop sourcing, and you just talked about a little bit about that. But before I dive into that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about hop blends. You use a lot of hop blends instead of using a single hop in your brewing. It was one of the things that I found very interesting when I got a chance to brew with you.
Yeah, I think that that's both a kind of a survival technique in this industry, as well as a way of adding complexity to beers. As we all know, as brewers, hops vary seasonally, and trying to create beers, especially single hop variety beers, is tricky in sourcing good quality over time. You mentioned John Mallet earlier, and they have Two Hearted, which really focuses on centennial hops, and John has to work really hard.
I think it's 100% centennial, right?
Yeah, and that's tricky because if there's an off year in centennial, you're scrambling. But I mean, it's that, but it's also the fact that by combining hops, we can create new flavors and something unique to our brewery. And so it's a combination of those things. And yeah, some of our newer releases like Luponic Distortion really focus on blending hops to create unique characteristics.
It was pretty cool. Near the end of the craft beer brewing event, we were selecting a hop blend to use for dry hopping, I think. And you literally laid out, we opened up like 10 packages of hops or 12 packages of hops and laid them all out on the table and started sampling and smelling them to make the selection. Can you tell us about that? I mean, is this something you do in the brewery too?
Yeah, I think there's no better way to get to know your raw materials than to, in the case of malt, to chew malt, make Congress wort, and actually taste it in the absence of other raw materials. And same with hops. We do a lot of selecting of hops initially. So at harvest time, we'll go to Yakima, for instance, and talk with the farmers, look at brewers' cuts, rub those hops, and the main focus is aroma. That's what we're keying in on. And what you experienced is something that we do all the time in our brewery. I mean, more and more now that we have products like Luponic Distortion that we're creating, but getting our raw materials out in front of us. And I think the point I was trying to make that day was that, you may focus on a particular hop, call it Simcoe or Amarillo, and because somebody else made a great beer with it, But if the raw materials that you sourced aren't in good shape, there's no sense in using those. And we spread all the varieties that we had available to us and realized that some of the ones that we wanted to use weren't as good shape as, I think El Dorado was one on the table that was really showing well.
Yeah, I remember there's one, and I don't recall which variety it was, but it was a real stinker. I mean, it was it was lousy.
Yep, and and that can happen. I mean, you can have a great hop in the field and take a brewer's cut and really fall in love with it, and then it gets destroyed in the pelletizing process, or maybe it wasn't stored properly. I mean, there's a number of different things that can happen. So, I always say, crap in, crap out. I mean, we need to look at our raw materials at the point of use and make decisions. And that was a case where we kind of called an audible there. We went through all the hops that we had available and changed the dry hop accordingly. And we do that all the time.
You just picked, I can't remember, 3 or 4 varieties that were kind of popping that day and threw them in as dry hops, right?
Yep. And that's what's so fun about Luponic Distortion, in that every quarter we kind of get together, go over all the hops we have available, along with the experimentals that are being offered to us by our vendors and growers, and pick our favorites and pick a new blend and go forward with it, and kind of reserve the right to tweak that as we move forward, to basically just try to make the best beer possible with the raw materials available.
Now, you mentioned sourcing is an issue for, especially for large commercial brewers, certainly an issue for home brewers as well, because we're at the end of the supply chain. We usually get whatever's left over. What'd you learn on, sourcing beers like Etsy Jack, for example?
Well, there's a whole world of hops out there. And again, I think we got pretty focused in on Cascade and Centennial earlier on, craft. Those are still hops that are, the most predominant hop available out there in the industry. But I mean, obviously there's a bunch of new hops coming through all the time. Easy Jack specifically, we learned that there were some wonderful cultivars coming out of Anton Lutz's program in Hull or in Germany, and focused in on hops like Mandarina Bavaria and Hull Melon. Hallertau Blanc was another hop that we found, that is very reminiscent of Nelson, grown in New Zealand. And, most of us know Nelson's nearly impossible to get if you're a small brewer that doesn't hold contracts. And so there's some alternatives out there. And I just, I'm fascinated. I'm taking a trip in 2017 to South Africa. And part of that trip is to study a little bit about the hops that are grown down there. And Luponic number 4 focused in on some South African grown hops. So, there's a lot I think a lifetime worth of hops to explore out there.
Well, you mentioned you're tied into the entire international hop market, and it is a worldwide market now. It's not really a regional or even a national thing anymore. How does Firestone Walker go about sourcing hops from around the world? And tell us some of the things you've learned traveling around the world, learning about hops.
I mean, most of it has been just driven by our interest in hops and hoppy beer styles. And the vast majority of our connections are long-time connections with, first and foremost, the brokers. It's interesting that there is an option to go directly to farmers, and oftentimes that's a lot of fun. It's great to get to know the growers themselves and find out where exactly your hops are grown. But the brokers really have an important role in all of this. They're kind of the organizers of the greater hop industry. And when working through a broker, you have a lot more choices in terms of maintaining quality over time and consistency. But we do have a lot of fun meeting farmers, going out and working in the fields to just learn more about what goes into making a good quality hop. There's a few of us that have gotten together and formed what we call the Hop Quality Group. And that's a non-for-profit that works for all craft breweries, basically communicating brewers' needs to growers, really trying to focus in on food safety and good practices. And a lot of that was focusing on the fact that so much is going in, or craft brewers in general are putting more hops in late. And then you start talking about food safety and the integrity of those hops, and really changing the way the world looks at hops in terms of its use. 20 years ago, 90% of the hops going into beer were going into the boiling kettle. Now the vast majority of hops that are grown now for the craft industry are going in as dry hops. And so we really need to look at and focus on those as a food product.
That's interesting. I mean, are there real risks with that, dry hopping with, a product that was once boiled?
Well, I think, from a brewer's perspective, it's always about sanitation. So we don't want any kind of cross up. But certainly also just in the fact that we're looking for the essence of those hops to be expressed as purely as possible. So how they're handled, and if we practice just basic food safety practices that the rest of the kind of food world use, I think goes a long way to the integrity of the finished product. I think that that goes along with some of these new cultivars that are coming. It's more about the essence. We're focused much, much less on alpha. In fact, I think early on in the hop quality groups, it was all about aroma and not about, say, isoalpha acid levels and the bitterness potential or brewing value kind of, measured as bittering. So it's a whole new way to look at hops. It's an exciting world, and I think another piece of this is that growers are getting as excited as brewers about it. And, you certainly have met a lot of enthusiastic and excited brewers. We get pretty passionate about what we do, and hop growers are very similar, and they're really excited about growing for this new kind of craft brewing world.
So, I mean, our understanding of hop oils has really evolved quite a bit over the years, too. Are the growers starting to focus on things like myrcene and caryophyllene and all the other hop oils now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think most of the new research is focusing on aroma or minimally dual-purpose type hops, flavor hops, we like to call them. I know of at least one grower who now has a GCMS in their lab on the farm so that they can look specifically at flavor active compounds and start changing their kind of agronomic programs to promote the best possible aroma. I mean, that's something you'd never heard of 20 years ago.
And as the science evolves too, I mean, have we learned more about whirlpooling versus dry hopping and how that affects the various aroma oils?
Yeah, our brewery has always been pretty heavy in late hopping, a lot of whirlpool hopping, a lot of dry hopping. I went to the Brau in Germany this year, and it seemed like every kind of, equipment supplier, international equipment supplier had now some new dry hopping technique or implement. So the greater industry has really woken up to this kind of change and, are trying to dive in and learn more about it. But I think if you talk to any serious hop chemist out there, they'll tell you that there is a whole frontier of unknown. We certainly have more powerful instruments to look at these things. We know a lot more about the chemistry, and it seems like the more we learn, the more we realize we don't understand about the synergistic relationship between flavor active compounds and hops in the greater beer world. And so there's plenty to learn. A lifetime worth.
I think it was Charlie Bamforth told me one time there's over 500 flavor compounds in hops, I think, something like that.
Yeah, and a lot of them can be changed by yeast and fermentation. So there's a whole nother kind of curveball that gets thrown at you when it comes to hop volatiles and flavor. How things react with what comes from our malt. It's an incredible body of work.
So, I mean, working for Firestone Walker, do you get to work really closely with the hop growers as well as, obviously you buy from brokers, but how closely do you get to work with them?
We spend a lot of time, and I think more of it's, we're just fascinated and we like to geek out a bit, but we make a few trips every year to the different hop growing regions. For the last few years, we've been spending more time in Europe because we're sourcing more and more from predominantly Germany. Not as much from Southern Hemisphere, although, very curious about and want to spend more time there. And, Yeah, I think, trying to get familiar with picking windows for all the varieties that we use, and that aids in selection, kind of knowing if it's early pick or late pick and how ripe we like those hops, doing a lot of hands-on selection. And, more than anything, it's just interfacing with the folks that are closely involved with all this, and learning more and more about how to source raw materials better. You talk to John, and he's doing the same thing in malt. And barley sourcing, and gosh, there's a whole other world there. There are a couple organizations that are really focusing on flavor-forward malts for craft industry, and that certainly is going on in the hop world as well.
Have you teamed up with any of the new small hop growers? I know there's people that are growing, things out of the Willamette Valley now. People in New York, people up in the Midwest are starting to grow hops.
Yeah, one in particular is Hophead Farms in Michigan. And although we haven't used a lot of Michigan-grown hops because that group is really just starting to take off, and a lot of those hops are being fed into local breweries there in the Midwest, we've certainly learned a lot. And it's very interesting to look at a Cascade hop, for instance, grown in the Midwest versus the West Coast. They're different. There's no doubt about it. Different in good ways. So I think there's some exciting things going on. And Michigan in particular has developed a very strong and I think stable industry with good downstream practices in terms of the picking machines that they choose and the pelletizing presses that they use, and their way of packaging and delivering hops. And I think that's going to be a real key to these outside regions developing and being successful, is their ability to handle the product, not just grow it well, but to process, package, and deliver those hops in a sound way to the brewer.
So have you guys had a chance to team up with any of the folks from Michigan and produce it, use it in your beer? You use a particular hop style in your beer?
Yeah, none of it has found its way into our mainstream. We've done more pilot work. We've also worked with them in sourcing some hops abroad. Actually, some of our German Mandarina comes through Hopheads, believe it or not. They spend a lot of time focusing on international hops as well. They're growing cashmere in Michigan now, and I'm really excited about that because I think that hop has a lot of potential. Midwest-grown Chinook is pretty interesting as well.
Interesting. Well, how do you actually go about developing and evaluating new hops to include in your beers? Do you guys actually sit down and do a flavor panel? How do you do it?
Honestly, it's very similar to what you saw in Colorado. In some ways, it's not very scientific, and it's somewhat informal in that we can just spread these raw materials out on a table. We can look at them blindly, but ultimately we're rubbing hops and using our experience in terms of knowing the beers that we're brewing well to decide on which hops to use in dry hopping and which hops to blend together. I mentioned earlier about the South African hops. I mean, they came to the brewery. We knew nothing about them. There was, enough analytical information to kind of familiarize ourselves with what they might do in terms of bittering potential, et cetera. But all of what we learned aromatically was just done by rubbing those hops at the table, kind of making a call and moving forward into brewing them. So, I mean, it's kind of a, more about experimentation and just taking some risks, I guess, at some level, using your relationships to make sure that you're bringing something in that's interesting. There's a lot of breeding going on to kind of bring forward hops. I mean, Mosaic is a great example of a hop that came out of a breeding program more recently here in the United States.
Yeah, I got some in my fridge right now.
Yeah, great hop. I think it was Jeremy from Lagunitas told me it was almost like a dummy-proof hop. It's like, man, you dry hop with that, you're going to make a good beer no matter what. But, so there's some wonderful things coming out of these breeding programs, and, I guess just staying in pace with them and being willing to experiment. We, in the last few months, commissioned our new pilot brewery down in LA. It's a 10 hectoliter system, so that allows us now to do some single hop and experimental brews with some of these new hops to familiarize ourselves with them. So you just have to stay active, stay on top of it.
Now, how big's your pilot brewery? It's probably like 10 times as big as my brewery, right?
Well, it's a 10 hectoliter. Okay, so it is a brew pub system.
1,000 liters, right?
Yeah. 1,000 liters. But, you got to realize we have 3 pretty busy pubs. So 10 hectoliters of beer goes really quickly on draft in our pubs.
Nice. Well, I want to ask you about, are you guys experimenting at all? I know you said you do a lot of dry rubs. Do you do any hop teas? I know the ASBC just put together a new standard for doing teas with malts, actually, like a hot tea with malt and let you evaluate the flavor of the malts. I was wondering if you do any of that with your hops.
We've experimented with what I would call more cold steeping or cold teas, I guess you would call it, where we take a small known amount of beer and add, a proportional amount or something similar to what we would try to be doing on the floor to get a feel for how those hops are going to perform. Honestly, the rub, what you're calling the dry rub, has seemed to be a better tool for us anyway than any of these tea methods. Mm-hmm. However, interestingly enough, pellet density plays a big role in how the extraction in the dry hop is going to happen. If a pellet it goes through the dye and it's too dense or it's too hard, it'll tend to sink to the bottom of the fermentation and the extraction isn't as good without doing some rousing or some type of pump over or something like that.
I would imagine, especially in a conical, right? It's going to just sit in that little bitty area at the bottom.
Yeah, and that has a huge impact on how that hop's going to perform. And we'll look at that, say, take a flask of beer, put some pellets in, and observe how that pellet actually behaves. Does it float? Does it sink? Does it disperse nicely? And we work again with the processors to try to tune the pellet to our process, and that's actually been some work that's had a huge impact on our beers, no doubt.
Interesting. I never really thought about dry hopping and the pellets sinking to the bottom, but like you said, that would be a huge problem in a conical where the area down at the bottom of the cone is very small, right?
Yeah, and generally speaking, if you can take the pellet and it breaks up easily in your fingers, so it's a less dense pellet. That's going to behave better in the fermenter. And I think actually home brewers may be in better tune with this than some even commercial brewers because they're working in glass carboys in some cases, so they can visualize what's happening with those hops. If it's forming a cap, does that cap then fall later, or does that cap sit up at the top and dry out?
And the risk is a lot less in a carboy because if it sinks to the bottom, it's not necessarily going to be that much worse. You know what I mean? Because it's still got a pretty good area of distribution.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned me in advance. You have a new line out called Leo versus Ursus that you're working on. I was wondering if you could talk a minute about that.
Yeah, there's been some controversy, and we're not the only brewery out there doing this, but we actually are discontinuing a few of our what we call the proprietors reserve series beers. That's Double Jack, our double IPA, Wookie Jack, our black IPA.
No, you can't retire Wookie Jack. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
Not allowed. That is the most interesting beer, I think.
Well, we're going to continue making it on our 10-barrel system for our pubs, so growler fills here in California will still be available. We're not going to bottle and ship those things nationally anymore.
Only to Virginia, right? Only Virginia?
Yeah, sorry.
No.
It's all done at the end of the year. But what that does is it opens up a hole in the portfolio again for us to put some new beers in, and that's where this Leo versus Ursus comes into play. Really what it ends up being is a series of beers similar to Double Jack and Wookie Jack, IPA, kind of larger format beers, or when I say larger format, higher alcohol, higher hopping rates, more in that Proprietors Reserve series type beer. We haven't announced everything that we're going to come out with. The first beer is called Fordham, and we're formulating a really interesting double IPA, utilizing some new hop cultivars. Not all of that has been completely worked out yet. We're still kind of in the experimentation phase. We're bringing in some new clarification equipment into the brewery. For the first time in 20 years, we're going to have a centrifuge in this brewery, so that is going to be employed in this process. So it's probably going to be an unfiltered double IPA. That being said, that would be one of your reserve beers, though, right? Yeah, it'll be a reserve beer. But what we learned from the luponic distortion experience is that in basically making beers that are going to be changed out quarterly or at some given time, we kind of control freshness on top of having a kind of a platform to experiment with. So Leo versus Ursus, like luponic distortion, will only be out for 90 days at any given shot, pulled back out of the market, and another beer will be put in its place. And I think it's a real challenge for at least, breweries like ourselves that are in more of a national footprint. When I say national, we're not even in 25 or 26 states at this point, I think, at the most. So we're in about half of the states here in the U.S. But, beers like Double Jack and Wookie Jack that were made year-round tend to go out into these, far-flung markets. And we see a lot of older beer. And even 60, 90-day-old beer, in my opinion, is not a great thing for those type of beers. And there's kind of a new age now where a lot of, beer geeks, a lot of beer consumers are going direct to the source. They're standing in line and buying day or week old double IPAs from their local producers. And we love that concept. We love the fact that the beer lovers out there are keyed into freshness and quality in terms of, the shelf life of these beers. So, we want to play along with that. We want to promote that. We've always blazed the born on date or the package date on all of our products and really pushed for freshness. We have a page on our website that allows you to report old beer in trade. And it's not like whistleblowing, like we want to get anybody in trouble. We want to get that beer out of there and get fresh beer out there. And we think that this new Leo versus Ursus program is really going to help promote that. And on top of it, it's going to be a lot of fun for the brewers. It's, an opportunity to formulate some new beers and have some fun with all these new raw materials that are available.
Yeah, a couple of my favorite nano breweries here. It's great because you walk in, they've got a tap room, and they basically never brew the same thing. And so every time you walk in, there's like 10 different new beers on the shelf, and it's fantastic. So,
I mean, if you were to talk to our kind of sales and marketing team, they find that rather frustrating at some level. Yeah. It throws a curveball at kind of, I guess, traditional beer sales. But as a brewer, I love it. It's really challenging. And, quite honestly, Firestone was the type of brewery where we really, really focused on a beer like Double Jack. We took a good year or so in formulating that product to get it right. And then we released it. And we don't do that very often. It seems like maybe one new beer or one beer every other year or something like that was coming into the market. So these programs are allowing our kind of creative side to really express itself at some level. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I don't think these guys had a big marketing team. They had they got a couple brew kettles and that's it. So not a lot of arguments.
You try to name a beer and just you come up with something creative and then Google it and put the word beer behind it. There isn't a single name available. You just start making up words using other languages.
Awesome. Well, I want to tell you, you mentioned luponic a couple times. Can you tell us about what luponic actually is? I think it's a pretty interesting concept.
Yeah, I think we touched on it earlier a bit, but the base beer is 5.9% alcohol, so it's a very kind of middle-of-the-road IPA or strong pale ale. And what we're doing is changing the hopping of the beer. So the base beer stays the same all year long. And every 90 days, we're changing the dry hops. And we kind of reserve the right to tell you or not tell you what those hops are.
Sorry, I mean, is a base beer always, is the bittering hop always going to be the same then?
So far we've kept the hot side hopping the same. And that's more for us and our curiosity on what the impact of the dry hops will be. And the coolest part, and I keep talking about this, the fun part about that beer is that there are all these new cultivars coming around, and we had a pre-established portfolio with pre-established recipes, and we just didn't have a home for some of these new hops. Even Mosaic hadn't found its way into our program because we hadn't released out a new beer to use that hop. So it's really all about experimentation. We change the hopping every 90 days. That could include and does include a lot of experimental cultivars that really aren't available in large quantities, so it's perfectly tooled for a program like this. We can take a couple 1,000 pounds of hops, which sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot in the greater brewing world, and actually make a beer with it and get it
Sounds like a lot to me. I don't know.
sold into the greater hop market.
If I order a pound of hops,
little,
it's something special,
Fires. I shouldn't probably throw these numbers out there, but a brewery like Firestone Walker sources almost 500,000 pounds of hops a year to make our beers. So.
Wow.
No pressure.
That's a lot of hops, yeah. I don't think that would fit in my fridge. It's the only problem. Yeah.
We support a lot of hop grower families, that's for sure.
Awesome. Well, I understand you're also partnering up with Duval to do some new brews. Tell us about that.
Well, about a year and a half ago, we did partner with Duval Morgat. Duval Morgat has ownership in now 3 breweries in the United States, and they're really awesome breweries. It's Omegang in upstate New York. It's Boulevard in Kansas City, and now Firestone here on the West Coast. And, that partnership allowed a couple different things to happen. One thing for us, it gave us a lot of exposure to, basically a 150-year-old beautiful Belgian brewery and all of their resources. It also allowed us to expand here at home. And you can't hear it, but on the other side of the wall, just on the other side of my office here, there's a brand new brew house going in that I'm super excited about. This brewery's been pretty tapped out in terms of capacity over the last year. And so we're working diligently to address that and put new equipment on the ground. I'm
afraid to ask, but how big is that brewery?
That's a 300-barrel brew house.
300 barrels, okay.
Yeah, so we currently have an 80-barrel brew house. And it's a bit of a crazy brew house. We have a 7-vessel brew house with 2 milling systems, dry milling and wet milling. We have a single mash mixer, 2 lauter tons, 2 pre-run vessels, a boiling kettle, and a whirlpool. And that system allows us to do up to 16 brews a day. So even though it's a relatively small brew house, we can move pretty quickly. And it served us really well because we do have a family of kind of smaller batch specialty beers, Parabola and all of these that we can make on that smaller brew house. But we have some other beers like Union Jack, like Easy Jack, like Luponic, and locally our 805 beer, our Blonde Ale, that, could really benefit from a larger brew length. And so this new brew house is going to help us out a lot. The old brew house stays where it's at and continues to make specialty beers. And so I think you're going to see a lot of really cool things coming out of this brewery in the next couple of years once we get this new capacity online. And really back to the partnership with Duval has allowed a lot of this growth to happen without the ownership really stressing out. I think we were really longing to partner with somebody who was of like mind. The Duval brewery in Purs is actually smaller than Sierra Nevada. So in a sense, they're a craft brewery, much like ourselves. They've just been around a lot longer. If you look at their portfolio of beers, they're all really tasteful, artful, beautiful beers. And so we found that partnership to be really intriguing. And I think an interesting part is that our brewery has never really focused on Belgian styles. And now we have a partner who can really teach us a lot about that. A side note to that topic, though, is that Jim Crooks, who heads up our Barrel Works facility down in Buellton, so that's where we make all of our sour beers, far, far away from our production brewery.
Probably wise.
Yeah, he's been spending a lot of time going over to Belgium, working with the brewers in Purs and also the brewers at Liefmans on barrel aging. And, it seems completely wild, but that brewery has been so focused on Belgian Golden Ale and the Abbey beers that they make and the other beers. And Liefman's been very focused on making stainless steel sour beers that they really didn't have the kind of experience you would imagine in barrel aging. So not only have we been able to learn a lot on the brewing technology front, how to grow our brewery in kind of a responsible way with a real European kind of influence, at the same time, we've been able to go over and show them how we're doing barrel aging. They're putting some beer in bourbon barrels in Purs, and Liefman's putting some beer into wine barrels. And it's a real exciting exchange that's a two-way street. Pretty amazing. On top of that, we did do a collaboration with Boulevard. So now I'm working very closely with Stephen Powell at Boulevard. And we just did their number 6 collaboration, which was a barrel-aged release. That was a lot of fun. And we've got a kind of a sour beer collaboration that we did with Omegang that's still in the barrels that will be released sometime next year.
Awesome. Sounds like you got a few exciting things going on at Firestone Walker right now. So I just wonder if you had any closing thoughts, Matt, before we go.
No, I mean, you and I met at a kind of a homebrewing event, which I thought was really fortuitous.
I had a great time up there. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and there's no real agenda. We got together to talk about hops, and I think that was influenced by what we were doing up in the mountains, making a hoppy homebrew. We're still just as excited about the craft beer industry and learning and all of this. Those of you who are listening and aren't that familiar with Firestone, I encourage you to come to Central Coastal California and visit us. It's a beautiful part of the world. We're tucked right in the middle of wine country. And we're kind of the brewery between 2 giant kind of brewing areas in terms of craft, Northern California and Southern California. We always say we're at the Central Coast. We're the more sensible brewers in the state. So come and visit us.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And I was, honored to have Matt Brynildson joining us today. Matt is the brewmaster at Firestone Walker. He is the 5-time GABF Brewer of the Year and 4-time World Beer Cup champion. And Matt, it was great having you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Well, a big thank you to Matt Brynildson for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue is packed with great information for brewers and craft beer fans. Take advantage of their fantastic sale now and get your 1-year subscription for only $19.99 from beerandbrewing.com. And also the world-class line of brewing equipment from Blickman Engineering. John Blickman has his first ever holiday giveaway where you can win a Brew Easy system, Quick Carb Instant Carburetor, Hellfire Burner, or new Brew Vision controller. You can enter for free by clicking on the banner at blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And finally, my BeerSmith software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers, lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Download your free 21-day trial today from beersmith.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week and a great holiday.